Hello and welcome to my channel, In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I have thoughts. Today my thoughts center around the story of Sense and Sensibility, which, if you've been following along with our Jane Austen 250th anniversary celebration that Charlene and I are hosting, was the read for February. It was Jane Austen's first published book, and we all read it together in February and had a wonderful time. This was my third read of Sense and Sensibility, and while the last time I read it, I think it sank a little bit in my estimation, this time in reading it, it rose, and I enjoyed it much more than I did when I read it 2 years ago, around the same time of year. So these are just my personal, uneducated thoughts and opinions about the book Sense and Sensibility, and about what Jane Austen was or wasn't trying to say in the story, things that I observed, things that I noticed on this reread, as well as some things that I learned from my reading of this annotated version by David M. Shepard, which did have some very helpful information that gave a little bit of context to some of the themes and some of the issues that arise in the book. So I really appreciated reading this annotated version this time around, and definitely some of my thoughts were influenced by that for sure. One question that has to be asked about every book is why? Why did the author write this book? What were they trying to say? What was their purpose? Sometimes it's obvious and the author makes it clear. There's no question about what the theme is or what the author is trying to accomplish. In this case, it's quite obvious, even from the title, Sense and Sensibility. Austen is exploring and discussing, comparing and contrasting, if you will, sense versus sensibility. And to that end, it is, as David M. Shepard said, but also I would agree to a certain extent, it is one of Jane Austen's more didactic or moralistic novels. She is trying to make a point. She is trying to teach you something here. I do think that all of her novels have that to a certain extent. And I think there is a place to argue that Mansfield Park is potentially more didactic than Sense and Sensibility, which is why maybe a lot of people wouldn't like that one as much. But there's no denying that Austen has a point that she is making very strongly throughout this book, and her point is one of contrasting sense versus sensibility. And definitely one of those things is higher in her estimation than the other, for sure. So first of all, we have to understand what is meant by these terms, sense and sensibility. And to know that, we have to understand the context in which Austen wrote her book, which was in an era when Romanticism was overtaking the Enlightenment era in terms of the cultural norms of the day and the philosophies that govern culture at the time, the philosophies that were behind a lot of the art and science and music and theater and literature and poetry of the day, the driving influences that shaped the cultural thoughts. And Romanticism had a lot of facets to it and aspects and elements to it that were basically all directly reacting to the age of reason and enlightenment, where everything was balanced and reasoned, where reason was the highest good. Now in the Romantic era, emotion and passion would be the highest good, rising above reason and logic. In the Romantic era, what was natural, like what was occurring in nature, was valued above that was man-made or industrial. Of course, at the same time, industrialism was rising. It was the industrial age was beginning to boom. So these things are at war and at contrast with each other in the culture. But people were trying to embrace nature as a reaction to the rising of industrial machines and man-made elements. The imagination and creativity were valued above strict reason and reality. In the Age of Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, what was realistic, what could be proven, was held to be the most valuable. But in Romanticism, what can be imagined, what can be created, is far better than what is actually real, what's right in front of you. In Romanticism, there was a strong emphasis on the self and the goals and the will and the passions and desires of the individual person as opposed to the group. what was good is determined more by one's individual self than by collectively. In Sense and Sensibility, the characters debate aspects of Romantic era topics repeatedly on more than one occasion and in various different facets and aspects of it and the way that they arise. These themes are also being debated by the actions of the characters, the things that they do and the things that they say and don't do or don't say, and how it plays out. And Austen is definitely trying to contrast these two schools of thought, reason versus Romanticism. And she's definitely showing the dangers, in particular the dangers of Romanticism. If Romanticism plays out to the fullest extent, what are the dangers of that? And what does it look like? Where does the logic fall apart? And the characters demonstrate various aspects of these either reasonable qualities or romantic qualities. Before we proceed any further, up until this point, there have not been any spoilers, but going forward, there definitely will be spoilers. So if that is a concern for you, then you will want to stop watching now and come back another time after you've read Sense and Sensibility. But if you don't care about spoilers and or you have already read Sense and Sensibility, let's keep going. Let's talk about the characters that we find within the pages of this story. We have, of course, Eleanor and Marianne. And most obviously, Eleanor is representing sense and Marianne is representing sensibility. They are two sisters and they are part of a family of four. Their mother, Mrs. Dashwood, and their younger sister, Margaret. Their father has passed away at the very beginning of the story, and the rest of the story is showing, what happens to them in the wake of his death and how they move forward through their life. At the beginning of our story, the Dashwood family live in Norland Park, but their half-brother John is the heir to Norland Park. So at some point during the first volume of the story, they are forced to move out of Norland Park because their half-brother John and his wife Fanny, they move in, and it just becomes uncomfortable for all involved. Fanny, John's wife Fanny, also has two brothers, Edward and Robert, and they come into the story. Edward, more so, he is a key character. He becomes a love interest of Eleanor, and Robert also plays an important role in the story towards the end of the story. I won't tell you too much about him. Also, Fanny and Edward and Robert have a mother, Mrs. Ferrers, who, while we don't necessarily see her on the pages of the story, she also is an important point in the plot, and she affects a couple of key aspects of the plot in this story. She controls them from off-site, and she controls her family with an iron fist and with a lot of puppet strings. She's a master manipulator, and she holds the purse strings in the family. So that affects a lot of things that happen in the story. Then we have Sir John Middleton and his wife. He is a distant relative of Mrs. Dashwood, and he offers, in contrast to what John Dashwood should have done, he offers Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters a place to live. At his home, he lives at Barton Park, and he invites them to come and live at a cottage on the estate, Barton Cottage. His wife is Mrs. Middleton, and she is the daughter of a Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Jennings also plays an important role in the story. When we meet her, she is visiting, as they did back in that time for a length of time. She's staying with Sir John Middleton and his wife at Barton Park. She is kind of like a jolly, happy person, a little bit thoughtless, and she doesn't always speak correctly or speak well or speak with manners and civility because she was a merchant's daughter, and so she comes from money but not from nobility. She doesn't have, the noble bloodline or whatever, but she definitely comes from a richer background. So anyway, that kind of creates an interesting character in her. And then her other daughter is Mrs. Palmer, who had recently married and is pregnant. And we meet Mrs. Palmer and Mr. Palmer a couple times throughout the story as well. They play a lesser role, but they do play a part in the story as it unfolds. We also have a young man named John Willoughby and his aunt. We don't ever actually meet his aunt, but she plays an important role in the story off-site, just like Mrs. Ferrers does. And John Willoughby becomes the love interest of Marianne, Eleanor's sister. And then we have Colonel Brandon, who very early on in the story falls in love with Marianne. For the most of the story, that love is unrequited. And he is a quieter character We hear a lot of his story, but we don't really get a lot of interaction with him. But he seems like a gentle, steadfast, faithful sort of soul. So how does the story go? What happens with all of these characters in the course of the story? Very briefly, as briefly as I can, let me sum up the story. It's a little bit convoluted in places of everything that happens in Sense and Sensibility. So Mr. Dashwood dies. At the very beginning of the story, we never really get to meet him. His son, John, inherits the estate, Norland Park, and that leaves his wife and daughters without a home. They have a very small amount of income allocated to them upon his passing. Mr. Dashwood instructs John to provide for his wife and daughters on the proceeds of the estate that he is inheriting. And John Dashwood makes that promise. But his wife, Fanny, later manipulates him and convinces him into not doing anything for his siblings. So Marianne and Eleanor and their younger sister, Margaret, as well as their mother, Mrs. Dashwood, are left without a home of their own. For a time, they live at Norland Park with John and Fanny and their family, but that becomes an untenable situation, and eventually they have to move out of there. But in the meantime, Eleanor meets Fanny's brother, Edward, and they spend a lot of time together, and they end up, each of them, falling in love with each other. Although they don't ever admit that to one another, they never confess their love for each other, they don't pursue a romantic relationship at this time, they just spend so much time together that they develop deep feelings for each other, and they have a relationship of mutual respect and great interest. Sir John Middleton, a distant relative of Mrs. Dashwood, invites Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters to come and live at a cottage on his estate, Barton Cottage. So they move away to Barton Cottage, and it is there that Marianne meets, in a very romantic setting and situation, John Willoughby. And she falls madly in love with John Willoughby. Meanwhile, they spend a lot of time at the Middleton's house, Barton Park, and they meet Mrs. Jennings, Mrs. Middleton's mother, and they spend a lot of time there. They make some friends there, and they meet some new people, including Colonel Brandon. Colonel Brandon falls in love with Marianne, but she does not notice him, does not give him the time of day. She is completely focused on Willoughby and doesn't pay any attention to Colonel Brandon, but the whole time he's falling in love with her. Willoughby very suddenly leaves, and Marianne is devastated. But when he leaves, when he takes his leave of her, he does not completely close the door on the relationship. So she is left with some hope that she might be able to connect with him again at some point in the future. They have demonstrated a romantic relationship in multiple different ways throughout the course of the story. They have never committed to one another. They have never established an actual engagement. And so Willoughby leaves without confirming any of that. And so she's not able to contact him for the rules of the day, and everything is left kind of up in the air and unsettled in that regard. At the same time, Eleanor finds out that Edward has actually secretly been engaged to a girl named Lucy Steele, who was a character I forgot to mention to you. Lucy Steele and her sister Anne, who is also called Nancy in the story. Eleanor finds out that before she had ever met him, Edward had been secretly engaged to one Lucy Steele. And so, of course, this news is devastating to her, but they had never really formalized the relationship or put it into words or anything. It had been a sort of a nebulous thing. She just has this deep interest in Edward and love for him, but now she finds out that he's engaged to someone else. Both of the girls travel to London and stay in London for several months with Mrs. Jennings, and so much happens in the story here in London. At this point, Marianne and Willoughby's relationship is irrevocably shattered, and he ends up marrying a Miss Grey. Marianne is devastated. And then on top of that, eventually, towards the end of their time in London, Edward's relationship and a secret engagement to Lucy is made public, and then he suffers the fallout from that, which includes his mother cutting him out of her will and giving her inheritance to her other son, Robert. And then Edward and Lucy being kind of left in this situation where they have no income or very minimal income at that time. So Eleanor and Marianne leave London with Mrs. Jennings, and they stop on the way at the Palmer's house, which, if you can remember, Mrs. Palmer is Mrs. Jennings' other daughter. And while they are at that house, Marianne falls ill, deathly ill, and she does almost die. This gives her a lot of time to reflect and think, and she begins to scale back some of her romantic ideals. She comes to a much greater emotional strength and maturity during the course of this time, this long illness, and the time that she has to think, and in the danger of facing death. So she has kind of an experience of growth there and change and maturing through this illness that she has. Also, Eleanor meets with Willoughby during this time. Willoughby comes to the house in the dead of night, and he tells Eleanor his whole history, everything that he was thinking and going through at the time that he was falling in love with Marianne, and why he did some of the things that he did, why he left the way he did, why he married the girl that he married, what his situation is like now, his sense of regret. But also, we also see that he is motivated largely by selfishness, and he's a little bit weak because his love for Marianne was not enough for him to be willing to give up his stature of life and the things that he enjoyed, such as having, extra carriages and horses and dogs for his hunting, etc., all of that stuff. All of that trappings of the rich life, he wasn't willing to give up for Marianne. We are left with a little bit more of a sense of compassion to a certain extent for Willoughby. I did forget to mention that also during this time, it is discovered that Colonel Brandon and John Willoughby are connected by the story of a young lady who is connected by a sense of honor to Colonel Brandon. And also, I guess she was also I believe she was his niece as well. Anyway, and then John Willoughby had seduced this girl in question and left her alone and pregnant and unsupported. And so he's just really not a good guy all around. But after he comes and talks to Eleanor, you have a little bit more of a sense of compassion for him and the things that led him to do the terrible things that he's done. But all in all, you feel a sense of relief that Marianne escaped that relationship. So when they finally return to Barton Cottage, everything kind of gets wrapped up in the final segment of the book. And Eleanor and Marianne both arrive at a new place in their character development and in their growth. There's a lot that they work through. They talk through a lot of things together and with their mother, and everything kind of comes to its emotional conclusion. But then it comes to a conclusion in the storyline as well, because we find out that Edward has been released from his engagement to Lucy because, in a surprising plot twist, Lucy has managed to trap his brother Robert. Remember, he inherited his mother's estate after she cut Edward out of her will. So Lucy has managed to entrap Robert in marriage, and Edward is now free from his obligations. And so he comes and he and Eleanor get married. Colonel Brandon offers them a living on his property, or a job as rector. And so they have a place to live and they have a modest income. And also Colonel Brandon is finally able to be successful in his pursuit of Marianne, and they end up getting married. And so that's how everything gets all tied up and everyone lives happily ever after. Whew. Well, that was less than 10 minutes, so that's good. So I found it very interesting, the structure of this story. I think it's very interesting because structure is a huge aspect of the age of enlightenment and the age of reason. They were very interested in architecture, for example, that everything was balanced. If you did something on this side, then it also was on this side. There's a lot of federal architecture in our area, in the DC area, and in the homes of the presidents, because their houses were built during that time. And so federal architecture was highly popular in the time of the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and it always has that sense of balance, strong sense of balance. Whatever's on the left has to be on the right as well. And also the music of that time, very structured, very balanced. Everything followed like a specific form and kind of lacked a little bit of the excessive energy of the Baroque era. Not that it wasn't energetic, but it was a little bit different from the Baroque era in that sense. And it was very structured, like Mozart and his music, very structured. Haydn, not rigid, but just balanced. There was huge balance evident in all of the art of the day. And I see that also in this book by Austen. There's a very balanced structure here to her plot and to the way the story develops and unravels. If I were to classify it as a piece of music, like if I were analyzing this as I would analyze a piece of music, I would say it was in ternary form, or A, B, A prime. So we have the A section where we are introduced to all of the characters. And in the first part of the A section, they are living in Norland Park. But then they move pretty early on in the story to Barton Cottage. And so the whole first A section stays there. And it's laying out all the characters. It's introducing us to all of the main themes of the story. And we are finding out what's happening. Marianne and Eleanor are both introduced to their love interests in this A section. They begin to fall in love, and everything is looking positive for them. Despite the fact that they are kicked out of their home at Norland Park, they're building a new life at Barton Cottage, and everything is going pretty well for them, and they're making new friends, and they're falling in love, and it looks great. Then we have the middle B section, and this one is marked out by the fact that everything here takes place in London. And so they move to London, and at least Eleanor and Marianne move to London, and all of the tragic and catastrophic things that happen in the story happen in London. And here we find out some of the terrible things that Willoughby has done. We find out that Willoughby is going to marry Sophia Grey. We find out that he rejects Marianne in a most publicly humiliating way. And also in London, Eleanor is forced to meet Lucy on multiple occasions, and Lucy is constantly provoking her and making sly comments and trying to demonstrate her superiority over Eleanor, because Edward has chosen her, not Eleanor, ultimately. And also in London, Eleanor is forced to have a couple of very awkward encounters with Edward, and those scenes are always just so, like, the secondhand embarrassment is just a lot. Anyway, so there are some awkward scenes there. Then there are some very awkward things. Colonel Brandon asks Eleanor, once everything falls out about Edward and Lucy's engagement being made public, and then Edward is disinherited and his brother inherits the estate. And Colonel Brandon is very interested in Edward Ferrars and has a high opinion of him. So he asks Eleanor to communicate to Edward that he will give him a living at his estate so that Edward can marry Lucy, because Colonel Brandon has no idea, because it's never been demonstrated publicly by either one of them that Eleanor and Edward are actually interested in each other. Edward's not really interested in Lucy anymore. So all of this happens in London. And then when they leave London, there is another one more tragic catastrophe on their way back to Barton Cottage. And Marianne falls deathly ill, and she almost dies. And meanwhile, Eleanor has her conversation with Willoughby, where he kind of confesses everything, all that led to the decisions that he made and the things that he did. And so then the A prime section, which is like the beginning but different, is that they go back to Barton Cottage. There's a lot of healing that takes place. Once again, things are looking up for Marianne and Eleanor, although they're both sadder but wiser at this point in the story. They've gone through a lot. They're much more mature. They have a lot more emotional resilience, both of them, but especially Marianne. And they have learned a lot in this process. They're stronger people now. But also in this ending section, this A prime section, we have the resolution of their stories. Everything gets tied up. It turns out, as I said, that Edward ends up being free because Lucy has trapped his brother into marrying her instead, so that she can still have the Ferrars' money. And Edward is free to marry Eleanor, and so they do. And then Marianne ends up marrying Colonel Brandon, and again, everyone lives happily ever after, and they have the resolution of everything, but it happens at Barton Cottage, just like the beginning of their stories was at Barton Cottage. Now it all gets wrapped up there as well. Another way that I was looking at the structure as I was reading through the book was kind of like an X. So if you see an X, so I'm not sure if, like, I can't in my brain like point to the right place as you're looking at it, but let's say if I do it like this, if here's an X, these points here are Marianne and Eleanor. And at the beginning of our story, in the first A section, if you will, Marianne is, she's like at the top, and it looks like, you know, she's fallen in love with Willoughby, and he's a fantastic guy, and they seem like perfectly compatible for each other, and their life is going to be great and amazing. Eleanor is devastated because Edward is engaged to Lucy Steele, and it looks like she's never going to be able to marry Edward, and she has to deal on top of that with all of Lucy's little digs at her. So as the story goes on, Marianne falls quite rapidly because she experiences all the devastation of her broken relationship with Willoughby, not only because the relationship was shattered, but because her idealization of him is shattered as well. And what she believed about him to be true turns out to be completely false. And he was never the man that she thought that he was. And so she fell in love with an illusion. And so her line falls to this story. Whereas Eleanor's slowly is creeping up because she is able to withstand all of the struggles that she's going through. She grows through them. She learns through them. They don't ever overpower her. They are difficult for her. It's an uphill climb for her, but she's not falling. She's growing. And because of the way that she's responding to the tragedies that happen to her in her life, she is becoming a stronger person, and she's growing as a person, and she's persevering, and she always has hope and a consistent spirit of being able still to do the right thing and to live successfully, to live well, to thrive, even in the face of her difficulties. So her story is an upward climb, and then Marianne's is more of a fall. And then once we get past, the X point there. So Eleanor has been rising, Marianne has been falling. Marianne's story continues, but it doesn't end the way that she wanted it to. So her point just keeps going down. She ends up with a happy ending, but she has lost some of her health. She has lost her ideals. She has lost the man that she wanted. She ends up with a man who loves her and takes good care of her, but is not the man of her dreams. And then Eleanor does eventually she ends up at the top of the X. She ends up with the man of her dreams, and she is able to live happily ever after with him in a different way from Marianne. I think Marianne also lives happily ever after, if you will, but not in a rapturous sort of way that she would have wanted to, but in more of a settled, purposeful kind of way. And so that's kind of how their stories ended up. So that's how I was looking at their story as it was happening, as we were going through everything. Like Marianne's trajectory was like this, and Eleanor's trajectory was like this, like slow upward climb. Another aspect of the balance that Austen has in this story is the balancing of the characters. For every character in this story, I feel like there is an equal and opposite character, and sometimes more than one. Like this person is being compared with this person, and this person is being compared with this person over here. She's always like putting these people in positions where they compare and contrast with each other. So first of all, we have Marianne to Eleanor. Marianne and Eleanor are being contrasted. Of course, Eleanor is representing sense in the theme of sense versus sensibility, and Marianne is representing sensibility. And we're constantly this is where she is the most didactic, because she's constantly telling us Eleanor is sensible, well-reasoned. She does not allow her emotions to overpower her. She is always cool and calm and in control of her emotions, even though she feels them deeply. They never overpower her, and they never force her to do things that wouldn't be right for her to do. Whereas Marianne is overcome by passion and emotion in all of the time. It allows her to do things that she should not have done, and it allows her to make decisions that, in hindsight, by the end of the book, she realizes were poor decisions that were not made in the fullness of knowledge. And she thought she knew everything at the time, but she realizes that she didn't, and she makes dumb mistakes because of it, because she's so emotionally involved, and her emotions influence her decision making. So we have that distinct contrast between Eleanor and Marianne. Interestingly, there's two other sets of sisters. There's Lucy and Anne Steele. So we are contrasting them as well. And then there are Mrs. Palmer and Mrs. Middleton, who are being contrasted as well as sisters. So there's not only one set of sisters, but there's three sets of sisters, and we're seeing contrast, varying aspects of this contrast of their characters and of the sibling relationships. Mrs. Palmer and Mrs. Middleton don't really have much of a relationship. Lucy and Anne have a relationship, but it's not a very good one. It's a little bit of a toxic relationship. And of course, Eleanor and Marianne have a very solid relationship where they're able to influence and guide each other. They also are, I want to mention that Eleanor and Marianne are also being compared in their relationship aspect. So both of so Eleanor and Marianne were exploring their relationships, but both of them are in a relationship square, not even just a triangle, but a square. So we have in Eleanor's square, we have Eleanor, and then we have Edward Ferrars that she is interested in. And then we have Lucy Steele, who Edward at some point had been interested in, to the point where he asked her to marry him, but secretly, because he knew his mother wouldn't, or Lucy knew that his mother would not countenance the marriage. And so they wanted to wait until the point where his inheritance was secure in order for them to marry. I'm not exactly sure how they thought that would happen, but whatever. Anyway, so then over here, in the other point of the square, we have Miss Morton, I think her name was, who was the person that Edward's family wants him to marry, but he has zero interest in her. This is the financially responsible decision for him to make, the financially responsible person for him to marry. Neither Eleanor nor Lucy have money or position to bring into his relationship. Lucy doesn't even have gentility to bring, or upbringing, or education. She brings nothing but a pretty face. Eleanor at least has some level of gentility. She has education. She has manners. She has sense. She has good character. She brings a lot, but she doesn't have any financial standing. And then in the other square, we have Marianne. And then we have, I don't know who you want to put there, Colonel Brandon is the person that she ends up with. And Colonel Brandon is in love with Marianne from the beginning of the story. And then we have Willoughby, who is Marianne's love interest, the one that she wants to marry, the one that she is desperately in love with. And he does love her as well, to an extent, so far as it goes. But then again, there is Sophia Grey, who is the person that he ends up marrying for financial reasons, because he wants to maintain his lavish lifestyle. And so her money enables him to do that. Again, Marianne has some social position and status, but she has zero money. So it's not a wise financial decision for him to make, as much as he might love her. So we are comparing and contrasting these quadratic, if that's a word, relationships. And then we have also, there's like a mirror image happening here, because Eleanor is, or let me say it this way. Edward has already promised himself to Lucy, but he falls in love with Eleanor. So essentially, he is cheating in some ways. You can look at it in a way that he is cheating on Lucy by allowing himself to fall in love with Eleanor. And then over here, we have Willoughby, who falls in love with Marianne and encourages her by all of his actions and behaviors to fall in love with him. And then he cheats on her by engaging himself and getting married to Sophia Grey. Well, he engages himself to her before he has officially cut off his relationship with Marianne. So he's cheating on her in this sense. So Marianne is the one who is the first love, and Eleanor is the one who is the second love in this situation. So again, Austen is comparing and contrasting the flip side of their two love stories. There are a couple of other characters that Austen is contrasting here in these stories. This has already been a really long video, so I won't go into all of them in great detail, but obviously we are comparing Willoughby and Edward and their behavior in the face of their romantic relationships. In particular, I think that Austen is being very careful to emphasize that Edward never encouraged Eleanor in a romantic sense, because he knew that he was engaged in a prior way. And there are many debates, I'll get into this in a second, as to whether or not he morally should have even talked to Eleanor, knowing that his feelings were being engaged. But he kind of talks about it in the story. But anyway, moving on. He never says anything or does anything to Eleanor to indicate that he is committing to a relationship with her, or even interested in pursuing a committed relationship. So there's that. That contrasts with Willoughby, who has zero intention at the outset of ever marrying Marianne or being in a committed relationship to her. And yet everything he says and does implies that he is committed to their relationship. He does pursue her in a romantic sense. He does engage her emotions and her feelings intentionally. And it's not just a byproduct of spending time with her. He intentionally pursues her with a zero desire to actually commit to that relationship permanently in the form of marriage. So that behavior of Edward and Willoughby is contrasted. And then we have Eleanor is not only being contrasted with Marianne, but she's also being contrasted with Lucy, because Lucy is the person that Edward is first interested in, but there's quickly a comparison drawn between the character of Eleanor and the character of Lucy, and Lucy falls short, very, very short. So we can see why Edward, a mature Edward, would be like, oh, what was I thinking as a young man that I was interested in Lucy when here's Eleanor in front of me. Eleanor is a much better woman than Lucy ever will be. There's also a comparison between Mrs. Jennings and Mrs. Dashwood in their role as mothers, and they both have a lot of similarities. Mrs. Jennings has the disadvantage that she doesn't have any sort of social stature to speak of. She comes from money, but it was money that was made in business. It was not family money. So she's not like landed gentry sort of thing. And then she's like, upwardly well to a certain extent, but she's also like very down to earth. She has a lot of common sense. She doesn't have a lot of manners and the polite society veneer and polish, but she does have good common sense, and she does have a good heart, and that she has in common with Mrs. Dashwood. Mrs. Dashwood has zero common sense, like none whatsoever. She has zero common sense, but she does have good polished manners. She knows how to carry herself in social situations, and she is, a member of the landed gentry, even though she has lost her house. But she also has a very good heart. She does share that in common with Mrs. Jennings. So both of them, they come off mostly positive because they have good hearts. They love their daughters. They love their families. They love other people. And so they, because of that, they end up being sympathetic characters. But there is definitely some contrast going on in their parenting and the effects of it, and their sense or lack thereof that both of them have. And to a lesser extent, we are, like I said, there are several sets of sisters here being compared. So we are also in a much more understated way comparing Mrs. Jennings' daughters and Mrs. Dashwood's daughters with each other. So there's a lot of comparing and contrasting of characters and their various situations and their various things that they're going through in this life. But what are the themes in this story? The first one is really obvious: sense and sensibility. And the prevailing cultural views that were at odds with each other in that day of reason versus romanticism, and all of the things that entailed. Huge theme in this story, undeniable, unavoidable. Austen makes it very clear from beginning to end that's what her story is about. And so we are understanding that there are dangers in romanticism as they are played out by Marianne's story, because Marianne represents romanticism and Eleanor represents sense or reason. And so we're really seeing these things played out. To a certain extent, I think you could see that Austen is trying to demonstrate there's a little bit of balance to be had, that emotion is necessary and vital, but that it must not overpower our reasoning. Reasoning should always be the faculty that is in control of the choices that we make, of the things that we say, of the way that we engage with different people, the way that we use our manners or not. It should be governed by our reason rather than by our emotion, because our emotion will lead us, our passion, our self-interest will lead us to do things that are harmful to others or harmful to ourselves, because we are being governed by emotion rather than by reason and thinking things through. There's also a lot of discussion about beauty and aesthetic, which was a prevailing topic of the day as it relates to romanticism. In the annotated version, David M. Shepard had a paragraph that really helped me understand more about the romantic concept of beauty. In particular, the term picturesque, which pops up in more than one Austen novel, and it definitely was a topic of interest to her because it becomes a matter of discussion in several of her books. So I'm just going to read real quick this annotation by Shepard that explains it. The picturesque was a concept that had become very popular at this time. The term first appeared in the early 18th century and meant scenery that had the elements of a picture or was fit to be the subject of a picture. A critical inspiration for the concept was the landscapes of the Italian countryside by the 17th century painters Claude Lorraine and Salvador Rosa, whose works were celebrated for presenting an ideally beautiful and poetic vision of nature. The closer actual scenes from nature resembled these paintings, the more likely they were to be called picturesque. In the late 18th century, the concept grew in popularity and took on further connotations in the hands of certain writers. They identified the picturesque as one of the three main categories of natural beauty, along with the beautiful, which was used to refer to what was gentle and delicate and harmonious, and the sublime, used to refer to what was vast and overwhelming. The picturesque was used for scenery characterized by irregularity, roughness, and variation, features not fitting into either of the other categories. So like a bent and twisted tree or a castle in ruins, that would be considered picturesque. It was a type of beauty that would make a beautiful picture. It wasn't beautiful because it was naturally sublime or delicate or harmonious or any of those things. It was actually in ruins or something that was ruined or not perfect, but it was picturesque. So the characters in this story debate these aspects of beauty and whether the picturesque is truly beautiful or not. In fact, Edward and Eleanor and Margaret engage in a pretty lively discussion on the subject that I found very interesting in the story. So Austen is tackling that a little bit as well, but that is an aspect of Romanticism that she kind of gets into. Another huge theme in this story is money and the way money shapes a person, but also the way a person's character shapes how they handle their money and or their relationship with money. And so characters in Austen's books, and particularly this book, Sense and Sensibility, who have a healthy relationship with money, they understand its importance. They don't overestimate or underestimate how much money that they need for a given thing. They are generous, but not to a fault. And they are never motivated by money. They understand the need for it, and they will make decisions based on financial factors, but they are not motivated by money, and they don't have any greed or lust for money. So she's definitely analyzing this aspect of money from a variety of factors, from the fact that the Dashwood family, by which I mean the mother and their sisters, they don't have a lot of money, but they are able to live successfully on what they have. Eleanor's sense comes into play here because she has to guide her mother in the wise spending of their money and the wise expenditure of it. But that's all a part of the examination of what is a healthy relationship with money. And so they don't have a lot of money, but they are able to live well on what they have because of Eleanor's careful management. And then you have Mrs. Middleton, who came from money, and but she's generous, and Mrs. Jennings, she's generous with it. Her son-in-law, Mr. Middleton, he is generous with his money as well. Doesn't really think much about money because he has it, but he uses it. He's not like thrifty, but he's also not spending it lavishly, and he spends it on other people. He's very generous. And then we have Edward, whose money is completely tied up in his mother, and he learns to break free from that yoke and just to reject the hold that money has over him in her hands. And then we have Mrs. Ferrars and her how money makes her controlling and how she uses money to manipulate other people. And then you have John Dashwood, who and his wife Fanny, who's very greedy, and they are always struggling with their money because they're not wise with it. They're not generous. They're not kind and gracious with their money, and they use it all for themselves. And so they have tons of money, but they don't seem to know what to do with it or do well with it. Willoughby is always in need of money, and he's always spending it. That leads him to marrying a woman that he shouldn't marry, and he admits later on that it's a terrible marriage, but it gives him money, and so that's what he wanted. And also, Austen is touching on vice and immorality, as she does in all of her books. Her books have a darker thread running through them because there are some terrible stories of characters, in this case Willoughby, who are caught up in a vice of some kind and immorality of some kind, and the damage that it does to other people. Of course, in Pride and Prejudice, we have the same thing with Lydia Bennet and Wickham, and in Mansfield Park, we have a similar situation with the Bertram sisters and the things that happened to them because of their poor moral choices. So Austen definitely tackles these issues of vice and immorality in all of her stories. There's usually a thread running through that. She reminds us, it's not all like sparkling love stories of everyday people who live, just great, perfect, goody two shoes sort of lives. You know, there's an undercurrent there of the reality of sin in the world and how it affects people. And finally, I cannot finish this video without addressing the elephant in the room, which I alluded to earlier, and is the question of Edward. And was he cheating or not when he engaged in a relationship with Eleanor? Austen is making it clear from her perspective that while Edward made some mistakes, he never actively cheated on Lucy, and he always remained faithful to her in an official sense. You could say that there was definitely an emotional affair going on. That's true. And also, Edward acknowledges that. He explains how it all came to be at the end of the story. And he acknowledges that. And it's like the perfect textbook description of how someone ends up in an emotional affair with someone, that they just begins by spending time with them. But, and initially they tell themselves, it's okay because, you know, I'm engaged to Lucy and I know that I wouldn't ever be able to marry Eleanor anyway, for the same reasons I can't marry Lucy, because Eleanor doesn't have any money, she doesn't have any social standing, according to my mother. So, you know, this is a safe relationship. Also, we are siblings by marriage, so it's perfectly safe to spend time with her. And because they were related by marriage, they were able to spend a lot of one-on-one time together. So that thrust them together in conversation, and they had a lot of deep conversations that connected them to one another in a very real way, in a stronger way than Marianne was connected to Willoughby in all of their emotional, passionate love story. Eleanor and Edward had much stronger threads that tied them together because they're talking and their conversation that did not have any emotional overtones to it. That led them to a very strong and deep relationship with one another because they had so much intellectual connection there. And so that led to an emotional connection, but it started as like an intellectual level of connection. So then Edward says, you know, as he's and Eleanor are talking everything through at the end of the book, that when he started to fall for Eleanor emotionally during this time, he would, you know, make excuses for himself, or he would justify certain things and he would excuse certain things. A textbook sort of thing that happens with people in that situation. Also, concurrently at the same time, before he ever met Eleanor, he had become completely disillusioned by Lucy because as they both grew older, he matured and she didn't. And he saw that she was immature and manipulative. Well, I'm not sure that he understood fully how manipulative she was. I think he always saw her as kind of a sweet girl, but silly, and did not provide him the intellectual stimulation that Eleanor was able to. He wasn't able to have those intellectual conversations with her, so he didn't have that solid foundation of a relationship with Lucy. So he was already disillusioned with Lucy by the time he meets Eleanor. I think in his mind, he was hoping that if he just stayed away from Lucy and didn't really encourage that relationship in any way, that she would be the one to call it off. But he believed all the time that she was still steadfastly in love with him. She never loved him from the beginning. He believed that she was steadfastly in love with him, and therefore he needed to stay true to that because this sweet girl was in love with him and he didn't want to break her heart. So Austen is definitely painting him as honorable in that sense in the story. And she's definitely contrasting him favorably with Willoughby, who does not behave honorably in any way. So that's what she wants us to see Edward as an honorable person who got kind of caught in a situation of his own making, to be sure, but he's grown. And so by virtue of the fact that he doesn't act on his feelings for Eleanor, he maintains that veneer of honor. But many readers debate as to whether he was truly honorable or not, because he did allow himself to become emotionally entangled with Eleanor. And also he confesses to Eleanor that he convinced himself that even though he was falling for her, she wasn't falling for him. Because again, they never demonstrated their emotional feelings for each other at any point until he was free for them to do that. They didn't demonstrate or say in any way, you know, that they loved each other. So he didn't think that he was hurting anything in pursuing a relationship with her. He was only hurting himself, and that Eleanor was not likewise emotionally engaged with him, which was obviously in error on his part. And we can see that as the reader, but he couldn't see that as the person in the situation. So anyway, there is definitely room for debate there. I think that Austen excels at portraying real characters with real flaws. And I think that that is a flaw in Edward that's realistic, because it happens, and because it happens to everyday normal people like you and like me, who are neither wholly good nor wholly bad. I don't think it makes him an evil person. I think it just makes him a person. And we could debate in a literary sense, oh, well, I would never fall for Edward. But the truth of the matter is, when it comes down to brass tacks in real life, how many women have had relationships with men who, or women who have done similar things to Edward, have had emotional affairs or emotional interest in a person other than the person they were committed to. I think she's just showing us a realistic sense. And I think she's painting him in the best light possible, and she's purposely putting him in a situation that puts him in the best light possible. Like, if you're going to have an emotional affair, you know, the way she set up the situation was such that it's the most honorable, if it can be, way to have that. But in the end, you know, there's still the truth, the reality, and she doesn't shy away from it. She acknowledges it at the end of the story, that he did allow himself to develop emotions and feelings for Eleanor, knowing that he was engaged to Lucy and that there was no way out of that relationship unless she called it off. So anyway, it is a bit of a tangled thread there. I just think it points to Austen's ability to create really vivid, realistic characters that are human, like they do human things and they make human mistakes. And it means that he's not as much of a storybook hero as, say, Mr. Darcy, or Mr. Knightley, or any of her more noble heroes, but it makes him a real person. So I guess the thing is, I think that as readers, it's important to acknowledge that we aren't, generally speaking, given the chance of marrying storybook characters in real life, but that we have real people that we are living with and committed to. And how should that look? What would that look like? How would we react and respond in situations like that? Anyway, she opens up a lot of opportunities for conversation about that. So I am not coming to any conclusions here other than that I think that it was definitely a mistake that Edward made, that he should not have done. But he admits to it later in the book. It's a flaw. It's one that he grows from a little bit towards the end of the story. She doesn't spend a lot of time on his character growth or development in that aspect of things. He just kind of tells the story to Eleanor at the end. But he does acknowledge his wrongdoing, and they're able to move forward from it. So there's that. So that is a Sense and Sensibility. And wow, I think this video is going to be like an hour long, but that's okay. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion. Please add your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about Sense and Sensibility and your thoughts on any of the things I said, whether you agree or disagree, or if you have other thoughts to share, insight into the story or things you've learned about it. I would love to hear them. I would love to hear your thoughts. And tell me, how do you really feel about Edward? And I will see you next time. Bye.